The spring of 1945 brought silence to the ruined cities of Germany. Streets that had once echoed with the march of soldiers and the roar of propaganda loudspeakers now lay broken, filled with rubble, and the murmur of civilians searching for food. Imagine standing in the midst of this devastation, with the smell of smoke still lingering in the air and the outlines of burned buildings casting long shadows at dusk. Into this silence came the footsteps of men in unfamiliar uniforms, American officers who now held the authority once claimed by the Reich. Among them, to the astonishment of the local population, were Jewish officers whose very presence defied years of carefully constructed lies. For ordinary Germans, the experience was disorienting. They had been told day after day that Jews were weak, cowardly, and incapable of command. Now, the sight of a Jewish officer entering a town hall giving instructions in calm English or fluent German was something that did not fit into the world they thought they knew. Mothers whispered to children to keep their voices low. Shopkeepers who had once hung signs declaring Jews not welcome now stood nervously before Jewish men wearing American insignia, men who spoke with the authority of victors. The reversal was not only political, it was deeply personal. The atmosphere in these first weeks of occupation carried a strange mix of relief, fear, and disbelief. Civilians were exhausted by years of war, hungry for stability, and fearful of punishment. Yet the unexpected detail that many officers were Jewish introduced a tension that hung in every interaction. A simple document stamped with a Jewish officer's signature carried weight beyond its administrative value. It was a symbol that the hierarchy built by the regime had collapsed. For many, this realization struck harder than the destruction around them. Narrators of the time described the moment as one of quiet shock. There was no need for dramatic confrontation or grand speeches. The sight alone carried all the meaning that words could not. Imagine the silence in a crowded room when a Jewish officer stepped forward to read an order. Every glance exchanged between Germans carried the same unspoken thought. The world had turned upside down. In that silence, the lies of the past years seemed to crumble. The context of occupation was already heavy with emotion, but the presence of Jewish officers gave it a sharper edge. The ruined streets, the hollow eyes of the hungry, the echoes of defeat, all framed the image of men who represented survival against annihilation. For the Germans, it was a story they had not expected to live. For the Jewish officers, it was a moment that blended duty with history, the weight of orders with the shadow of memory. This was not merely the end of war, it was the opening scene of a new reckoning. Every day, small encounters reinforced the shock. A ration card issued by a Jewish officer. A meeting in a schoolroom where a Jewish commander explained new rules. A patrol led by a Jewish lieutenant through streets where once Jewish families had been hunted. These were not grand events, but they were history written in the details of ordinary life. Each one was a quiet reminder that the world the Nazis promised had collapsed, and in its place stood a reality that could no longer be denied. In those first months, the sense of disbelief lingered. People adjusted, some with bitterness, some with a quiet acceptance. Yet beneath the surface, the realization sank deeper. The occupation was not only a matter of foreign soldiers controlling a defeated land, it was also a mirror held up to a society that now had to see its own reflection in the authority of those it had been taught to despise. That was the early context, the hook into a story where ideology met its most human contradiction. The true conflict of this story lay not in battles of tanks or artillery, but in the silent clash between belief and reality. For years, German civilians had lived in a world where the image of the Jew was distorted beyond recognition. Posters, films, and speeches had hammered home the same message again and again. Jews were weak, corrupt, and incapable of honor. Now, in the hushed rooms of occupied towns, those very civilians stood face to face with Jewish officers wearing crisp uniforms and carrying the authority of the United States Army. The contradiction was not just startling, it was humiliating. It revealed a fracture between the ideology they had trusted and the truth unfolding before their eyes. Imagine the moment. A group of townspeople is called into the city hall to hear new regulations. The officer who walks to the front of the room is young, confident, and speaks with clarity. Then comes the realization whispered among the crowd: he is Jewish. Some lower their eyes, others stiffen in their seats, and a few can hardly disguise their unease. The atmosphere grows heavy, not because of what is said, but because of what his very presence means. The propaganda had insisted such a man could never exist, yet here he was commanding the room. For the officers themselves, this contrast carried deep and complex emotions. Many felt the weight of history in every interaction. Some had families who perished in camps not far from the very towns where they now gave orders. Others, born in the United States, had grown up hearing of persecution from across the ocean. Now they found themselves in positions their ancestors could never have imagined, commanding respect from people who once saw Jews as less than human. The irony was not lost on them. Every salute, every nod of obedience carried a resonance that words could hardly capture. There was no need for heated confrontation to bring the contrast into sharp focus. The simple act of a Jewish officer walking through a marketplace in uniform was enough to provoke stares and silence. German civilians who had once believed Jews were frail or cowardly now saw them as strong, disciplined, and in control. This was not a propaganda film, but living reality, and it forced people to reconsider everything they had been told. It was as if the walls of a carefully constructed house of lies had been knocked down, leaving only the rubble of disbelief. For many Germans, resentment bubbled quietly beneath the surface. To be ruled by foreign officers was difficult enough, but to see Jews in those roles cut far deeper into their sense of pride. Yet even within that resentment, the truth could not be avoided. The war was lost, the ideology broken, and the contrast could not be undone. For the officers, the challenge was to carry out their duties with professionalism, to rise above the weight of history, pressing down on each interaction. The conflict between propaganda and reality, between hatred and survival, played out not in violent clashes, but in the silence of occupied towns. In every corner of Germany, the presence of Jewish officers symbolized a contradiction too strong to ignore. For civilians, it was a painful awakening. For the officers, it was a moment of justice woven into the fabric of their daily work. This was the conflict at the heart of the story, the collapse of falsehood when confronted by undeniable truth. The story of Jewish officers serving in occupied Germany did not begin with the collapse of the Third Reich. It had its roots in years of struggle, migration, and determination. Many of these men had chosen to serve in the U.S. Army not only out of duty to their new homeland, but also out of a profound sense of purpose. For those who had fled Europe as children, wearing the uniform of the United States was a way to fight back against the forces that had driven their families into exile. For others born in America, military service was a chance to honor their heritage and to stand against an enemy that had turned hatred into policy. Their presence in Germany was not a coincidence. It was the result of choices shaped by history. Imagine the journey of a young Jewish immigrant arriving in America in the 1930s, escaping persecution with little more than a suitcase. Years later, that same young man would return to Europe not as a refugee, but as an officer in one of the most powerful armies in the world. The weight of that transformation cannot be overstated. Every salute he received, every order he gave, carried the unspoken memory of the journey from vulnerability to strength. For Germans who encountered him, the irony of his authority would have been difficult to process. For him, it was a living testimony to survival. Not all of these officers had personal connections to Europe's tragedy. Many were born and raised in American cities, children of immigrants who had fled earlier waves of anti-Semitism. They grew up in neighborhoods where their identity was both a source of pride and a reminder of difference. When war broke out, they trained, studied, and advanced through the military ranks like any other soldier. By the time they reached Germany in 1945, they carried not only the authority of their rank, but also the weight of representing a community that had endured centuries of persecution. Their background was diverse, but their presence in Germany was united by a shared significance. For German civilians, the origins of these men were rarely known in detail. Most only saw the uniforms and the authority they represented. Yet, behind each uniform was a personal story, often intertwined with the very land now under their command. Some officers could speak German fluently, having grown up in bilingual homes, and this added to the shock of recognition. A Jewish officer giving orders in the language of Goethe and Schiller, in towns where Jews had been stripped of citizenship and rights, was a moment that pierced through layers of ideology. It revealed that the past could not be erased, and that those once cast out had returned in ways never imagined. These origins mattered deeply, even if they were not always spoken aloud. They shaped how the officers carried themselves, how they responded to the civilians they now governed, and how they understood the magnitude of their role. A ration card was not just paper. A meeting in a schoolhouse was not just routine administration. For many officers, each action was framed by the memory of what their people had endured. Their presence was both practical and symbolic, blending the ordinary duties of occupation with the extraordinary weight of history. In the wider narrative of the war's aftermath, the background of these officers stands as a reminder of how history can bend in unexpected ways. Men once threatened by the ideology of annihilation returned as its undoing. Their origins, whether rooted in exile or in American birth, gave depth to their role in occupied Germany. For the civilians who encountered them, the details of their stories may have remained hidden. Yet the power of their presence spoke louder than words, telling a truth that needed no explanation. The battlefield of 1945 was no longer defined by trenches and artillery, but by the daily life of occupation. The war had ended, yet its echoes remained in every ruined street and shattered home. For Jewish officers, their presence in Germany was itself a victory, one that spoke without gunfire or speeches. Each time they walked through a marketplace in uniform, each time they addressed a hall full of civilians, they were reshaping the meaning of victory. The occupation was not only about the physical defeat of the Reich, but about a moral reversal that struck at the heart of Nazi ideology. Imagine standing in a small German town where the church bells had been silenced by bombings. In the town square, a Jewish officer gathers civilians to announce ration rules or curfews. The people listen quietly, some stealing uneasy glances at him, others staring down at the ground. His words are not loud, but the weight behind them is unmistakable. For those who once believed Jews could never command respect, this simple act is as powerful as any battle won on the front lines. It is the everyday proof that the Nazi vision of the world has been dismantled. The impact was felt most strongly in the intimate details of authority, a signature on an official order, the calm explanation of a new law in perfect German, a respectful nod to a civilian complying with instructions. These gestures may seem small, but in the context of occupied Germany, they carried profound meaning. They marked the transition from propaganda to reality, from ideology to truth. Jewish officers, by performing their duties with professionalism, exposed the fragility of lies that had once seemed unshakable. For the officers themselves, each interaction carried layers of meaning. Enforcing curfew regulations or distributing supplies was more than routine administration. It was a reminder that they stood in the very places where their people had been humiliated, stripped of rights, and sent to their deaths. To now hold authority, there was a symbolic triumph that transcended the paperwork and the daily routines. Imagine the emotional weight of stamping a document in a town where, only a few years earlier, Jews had been denied even the right to exist. The battlefield had shifted, but the struggle was no less real. The presence of Jewish officers also influenced the broader perception of the American military. For civilians, their authority demonstrated that the United States valued its Jewish soldiers, that their contributions were central to the victory. This undermined the deeply ingrained belief that Jews were outsiders, unfit for loyalty or courage. Here they were, entrusted with command, backed by one of the most powerful armies in the world. Their very position was an argument against everything the Reich had taught. In this sense, the battlefield was no longer fought with weapons, but with symbols and encounters. Every handshake, every command, every act of discipline carried the force of historical reversal. The impact was cumulative, felt in hundreds of small towns and thousands of daily interactions. Jewish officers did not need to remind civilians of the past. Their presence was enough. The war had been decided, but the occupation was where the meaning of victory became visible in human form. The battlefield of memory, authority, and truth left a deeper mark than gunfire ever could. It reached into the hearts of those who had once believed lies, and into the souls of those who had suffered under them. In the quiet streets of occupied Germany, the impact of Jewish officers was as decisive as any battle plan, rewriting the meaning of power in the very landscape where hatred had once flourished. The presence of Jewish officers in post-war Germany created consequences that reached far beyond the immediate needs of occupation. It forced civilians to confront not only the destruction around them, but also the collapse of an ideology that had shaped their daily lives. For years they had lived inside a system that demonized Jews, portraying them as dangerous, weak, or deceitful. Now, the sight of Jewish men in American uniforms giving orders with calm authority revealed that those teachings were lies. The contradiction pierced the silence of ruined cities more powerfully than propaganda ever had. Imagine a classroom where children once repeated slogans about racial purity. That same building now served as a meeting hall where a Jewish officer explained rationing rules to gathered families. The chalkboards were no longer covered with Nazi symbols, but with notes about food distribution and rebuilding schedules. Parents sat quietly, watching a man they had been taught to despise, speaking with dignity and clarity. The irony was impossible to miss, and though few would voice it aloud, the realization settled heavily in the room. This was not only a new chapter in governance, it was a reckoning with truth. For some Germans, the encounter bred resentment. It was difficult enough to accept defeat at the hands of foreign soldiers. To see Jews among those soldiers, elevated to positions of leadership, struck at the pride of those who had believed Nazi ideology. Whispers of bitterness followed Jewish officers in the streets, and cold stares sometimes met them in the markets. Yet beneath that resentment, the image of Jewish authority was inescapable. No amount of silence or hostility could undo the fact that Jews stood as representatives of victory. Other civilians, however, reacted with a different kind of reflection. Some began to see the collapse of the Reich's lies more clearly, realizing that their trust in propaganda had betrayed them. They watched Jewish officers carry out their duties with professionalism, fairness, and discipline, and were forced to admit that the caricatures they had been fed for years bore no resemblance to reality. Even those who did not change their hearts entirely could no longer deny the evidence before their eyes. The presence of these men planted seeds of doubt in the soil where hatred had once thrived. The wider consequences also touched the Jewish officers themselves. Every day they represented more than their uniforms or their commands. They embodied resilience, the survival of a people who had faced annihilation. For many, the knowledge that their authority directly challenged the very myths used to destroy their families gave their duties an added weight. Their professionalism was not only for the sake of military discipline, but also for the dignity of their heritage. To stand firm, to show fairness, was itself an act of defiance against the lies that had been weaponized for years. In the eyes of the broader American military, the presence of Jewish officers demonstrated the diversity and strength of its ranks. It sent a message not only to Germans, but also to the world, that the United States trusted and honored its Jewish soldiers. This stood in sharp contrast to the propaganda that had painted Jews as disloyal and weak. The fact that Jewish officers held real authority made the defeat of Nazi ideology visible in human form. Every interaction, every command, became a piece of living proof that the world was not as the Reich had claimed. The consequences of these encounters would echo long after the war's immediate aftermath. They showed that myths could be dismantled not only in trials and speeches, but also in everyday human presence. A Jewish officer distributing supplies in a ruined town did more to expose the fragility of hatred than any pamphlet or proclamation. In the quiet moments of occupation, the wider consequences unfolded. A society forced to look at the truth it had denied, and a people once despised now standing as symbols of endurance and authority. The climax of this story was not a single dramatic event, but a series of moments when the contradiction between ideology and reality became undeniable. In towns across Germany, civilians who had once cheered speeches against Jews now found themselves obeying Jewish officers. The silence that filled those encounters was heavier than any words. Imagine a crowded hall where orders were read aloud, and the realization passed quietly from face to face. The man in charge was Jewish. The weight of that recognition was stronger than the rubble outside, stronger than the ruins of bombed homes. It was the collapse of a worldview in the presence of living truth. In those moments, even the proudest citizens felt the sting of humiliation. The Reich had promised a world without Jews, a world where its ideology would reign forever. Instead, the war ended with Jews not only surviving, but holding authority in the heart of defeated Germany. Some civilians tried to avert their eyes. Others whispered in disbelief, but none could escape the fact that history had reversed itself. The lies of the past 12 years dissolved in the face of a uniformed officer calmly directing the reconstruction of their lives. For the Jewish officers, the climax carried an emotional depth that defies easy description. To stand in command where Jews had once been stripped of rights was a form of justice no courtroom could deliver. Each order spoken, each paper signed, was a reminder that survival had triumphed over annihilation. Imagine the private thoughts of a man who had lost relatives in Europe, now issuing commands in a German town hall. There was no need for revenge because the simple act of existing in that role was victory enough. This reversal did not require violence or anger. It was more powerful because it was quiet and undeniable. The world had shifted, and no speech or argument could undo it. A Jewish officer did not need to declare his identity for the meaning to be clear. Every interaction carried the same message. The ideology that had tried to erase him was gone, and he was here to stay. In that silent confrontation, the weight of history pressed down on everyone present. The climax was felt not only in the authority of individuals, but in the collective realization spreading across Germany. Civilians shared stories of Jewish officers in nearby towns, each tale reinforcing the truth. Some spoke with bitterness, others with disbelief, but all acknowledged the same fact. The Reich had failed, and its deepest lies had been shattered. No propaganda film, no speech from a dictator, could erase the image of Jewish officers walking confidently through German streets. For the officers themselves, the climax was both triumph and burden. They carried the responsibility of representing more than themselves, of embodying survival for an entire people. Every salute they received, every instruction followed, was a silent reminder of the world their families had lost and the future they now symbolized. The climax of this story was not a moment of noise and destruction, but a moment of quiet authority that no one could deny. It was history, written not on a battlefield, but in the eyes of those who were forced to see the truth. In the years that followed, the presence of Jewish officers in occupied Germany became more than a fleeting detail of history. It became a symbol of how lies crumble when confronted by reality. For civilians, the shock of seeing Jews in positions of authority did not fade quickly. Even decades later, some would recall the dissonance of those days when the men they had been taught to despise were the very ones shaping the order of their towns. This was not simply an administrative fact, but a turning point in memory. The occupation forced people to reckon with a truth they could not ignore. For the Jewish officers themselves, the legacy was deeply personal. Many carried the memory of those days for the rest of their lives, not because of the power they held, but because of the meaning behind it. To stand in uniform where their people had once been stripped of dignity was a profound form of justice. It reminded them that survival was not only possible, but triumphant. Their legacy was not written in battles won or medals earned, but in the quiet authority they embodied in the ruins of Germany. The long-term impact extended beyond the immediate years of occupation. For Germany, these encounters marked an early step in dismantling the myths that had underpinned the Nazi regime. The sight of Jewish officers disrupted the narrative of racial superiority in ways that court trials and speeches alone could not. It was a human contradiction that no ideology could explain away. Over time, this helped pave the way for a new understanding of history, one shaped not only by words, but by the lived reality of those who had survived. Imagine the symbolism. A ration card stamped by a Jewish officer, a meeting held under his supervision, a patrol led through the streets he commanded. Each act was small in isolation, but together they formed a living archive of truth. They told the story of resilience in a way that could not be erased. For every German who witnessed it, whether with resentment or reluctant recognition, the memory remained. It became part of the fabric of post-war identity, a reminder of how easily lies can collapse in the face of undeniable evidence. In the broader sweep of history, the story of these officers stands as a testament to endurance. It shows that power rooted in hatred can be defeated, and that those targeted for destruction can return as symbols of survival. Their presence in occupied Germany was not only about rebuilding a broken land, but about rebuilding the meaning of truth itself. The legacy lives on not in the names of individuals, but in the lesson their presence taught, that history can turn, and when it does, the collapse of lies reveals the strength of those who endured them. The closing chapter of this story is one of quiet triumph. No dramatic proclamation was needed, no fanfare of victory required. The legacy was written in the eyes of those who saw Jewish officers standing where none had expected them to stand. It was written in the silence of realization, in the dignity restored, and in the enduring reminder that truth, once revealed, carries a power greater than any regime. This was the legacy they left behind, and it remains a part of history's enduring record.